Hello and welcome. You're listening to the American Interest Weekly Podcast with me, Richard Aldous. The American Interest is your window on America in the world. You'll find expert commentary and analysis on our website, and you can follow us on Twitter at AMInterest and at RJAldous. Coming up on the show, podcast regular Walter Russell Mead with more on the inequality debate. But first, in March 2011, the United Nations authorised military intervention in Libya that ended 7 months later with rebel forces taking the country and killing its leader, Colonel Gaddafi. In the same month, peaceful protests began in Syria that evolved into a civil war that some say has killed more than 150,000. But here, the West and the international community has been reluctant to intervene. So why the difference in approach, and with what consequences? Joining me to discuss this is one of the leading experts on humanitarian intervention, Alan J. Kuperman, Associate Professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, and Jennings Randolph, Senior Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Alan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. So
Libya has been described by some analysts as a model humanitarian intervention.
Yes, it has. The narrative that you often hear is that there was a genocide brewing in Libya. There was going to be a bloodbath in its second biggest city of Benghazi, and that was stopped because of NATO intervention, which came in, averted that bloodbath, enabled the overthrow of a brutal dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, and put Libya on the road to democracy and peaceful development. That's the narrative. The problem is that that's essentially entirely untrue.
And when you say that it's entirely untrue, what's untrue about it? After all, NATO did go in, Colonel Gaddafi was overthrown, and to some degree, Libya has at least walked some way down the path towards democracy.
What I mean by being untrue is that there was no genocide impending in Libya. The death toll was relatively modest. The war was about to end. There was not going to be a bloodbath in Benghazi because there hadn't been a bloodbath in any of the cities that the government had retaken. When NATO intervened, it did not reduce the killing. It, in fact, greatly amplified the killing. The war, which was going to end in about a month and a half, wound up lasting for 8 months. The death toll, which would have been about 1,000 without intervention, wound up being about 8,000 or 10,000. Those numbers are disputed. Libya is not better off today than it was prior to the intervention. It's much worse off. There are much worse human rights violations. There is much greater destabilization. There is no security in the country. There essentially is no government in the country. The country is run by hundreds of separate militias. There used to be no significant radical Islamist element. Now there's a major radical Islamist element, including the militias that killed the U.S. ambassador in September 2012 in Benghazi. The neighborhood was relatively stable prior to the intervention. After the intervention, there was spillover that led to a civil war in Mali. Takeover of half the country by radical Islamists. We have proliferation of sophisticated weapons, including man-portable surface-to-air missiles that can take down conventional airliners, commercial airliners. So the situation wasn't very bad. That was mischaracterized prior to the intervention, and the intervention has made things much worse. In terms of humanitarian concerns and in terms of U.S. national security interests in the region and in terms of the day-to-day life of Libyans.
I suppose the counter to that maybe would be, well, if we look at what's happened in Syria, things are even worse, and there wasn't an intervention. So, either would you say, A, it doesn't really make any difference whether you go in or you don't, or B, that if there hadn't been a NATO intervention, then things could have been even worse, particularly as people are now saying that actually Syria looks as if it's going to be the kind of crucible of militant Islam and the next Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting contrast, because what was happening in Syria is what many in the West claimed was happening in Libya, but it wasn't happening. That is, in Syria, the government was shooting down peaceful protesters. That was not happening in Libya. In Libya, you had a violent uprising from day one, and the government was trying to defeat the insurgency by targeting rebels from day one in Libya. In Syria, the government was targeting civilians and killing on the order of 100 per week. And so if there was going to be an intervention on humanitarian grounds to try and save people, it should have been in Syria, not in Libya. And so would it have been easy in Syria? No, it wouldn't have been easy, but it would have been justified. It might have done more good than harm in Syria, as opposed to Libya, where it did more harm than good, because the situation was mischaracterized. There was no targeting of innocent civilians. There's another interesting connection between Libya and Syria, and that is that what we saw in Syria is that protests, which were initially mainly nonviolent for about 6 months in Syria, then switched and became violent, and we got the full-blown civil war that we see today. That switch from nonviolence to violence in Syria coincided with the NATO intervention in Libya to aid rebels. And so there's a lot of people, including me, who suspect that people in Syria looked and said, hey, we're protesting nonviolently and getting no help. In Libya, they're protesting violently and getting NATO intervention. So if we switch from nonviolence to violence, then NATO will come and help us. Of course, NATO didn't come and help them, but this is one of the additional negative consequences of intervening in these sorts of conflicts, is that you encourage other groups in other countries to launch rebellions and civil wars in the hopes of attracting intervention. That doesn't mean that intervention is never justified. It doesn't mean it doesn't sometimes do more good than harm, but you have to be very careful. That's what I've been trying to write about for 15 years. You need to be very careful. And if there's a civil war and it's essentially the government versus rebels, then in those sorts of cases, we generally should stay out from military intervention, because we will make things worse in that country, escalating the violence, and will encourage rebellions in other countries, getting even more civilians killed elsewhere.
So it sounds to me as if you're saying specifically on the question of Syria versus Libya that really we picked the wrong place to intervene and help. So you're not somebody who would say that humanitarian intervention is always wrong, but you're also arguing that any intervention, even if it seems like the right one, is always going to have unexpected consequences, as wars and interventions inevitably always do.
I think that's exactly. I would agree with everything you just said. That if we were going to pick one, we should have picked Syria, and that whenever you intervene, you need to be careful. There will be these sorts of unintended consequences. The last thing I'll say on this point is that our intervening in Libya made it harder to intervene in Syria, and that's because of our relationship with Russia. If you'll recall, Russia did not veto the UN Security Council resolution authorizing intervention in Libya, because the resolution said this was going to be an intervention to protect civilians. It was to impose a no-fly zone. It was not to overthrow the government of Muammar Gaddafi. And so when NATO decided to go past the authorization, exceed it, and switch from protecting civilians to militarily imposing regime change, Moscow was furious. Putin was furious. And then a few months later, when we came to the UN Security Council and said, let's authorize intervention in Syria, Putin said, no way. You can fool me once, but you can't fool me twice. So not only did intervention in Libya not help Libya, but because we essentially abused the UN Security Council mandate, it made it virtually impossible to get UN authorization for an intervention in Syria that really might have done some good. So it was the worst of all worlds.
Yeah, as you point out in the essay, part of the problem here is, I can quote directly from you, such a dynamic poses a dilemma for those who support the principle of humanitarian intervention but oppose foreign imposed regime change, given that one tends to evolve into the other.
Yeah, that's very well illustrated in the Libya case, because there's some debate about the genesis of the intervention, but I tend to believe that it was motivated sincerely by the desire to protect civilians, based on an incorrect reading of what was going on. And so this intervention, which was motivated simply to protect civilians, once it started, NATO said, well, we can't end this thing and leave Gaddafi in there. We can't cut a deal with Gaddafi because we've just said that he's murdering his own civilians. And so even though it started to protect civilians, it very, very quickly evolved into a military intervention to help the rebels overthrow Gaddafi. And they not only overthrew Gaddafi, but then they tortured and executed him in the most vile fashion. And there's a lot of people, I think, who believe in intervention to protect civilians, what's known as the responsibility to protect, or humanitarian military intervention.
This is what's sometimes referred to as R2P, is that right?
The R2P, exactly, responsibility to protect. There are a lot of people who believe in that, but don't believe that the United States or NATO or the UN should be going around and toppling governments around the world. And so what I point out is a tension between these two views, because it's increasingly likely that if you launch an intervention to protect civilians, that you're going to evolve to saying, well, part of protecting civilians is to overthrow this government. And so if you don't believe in overthrowing governments, it's one additional reason to be cautious about authorizing intervention under the R2P.
Is part of the problem here that the Kosovo intervention in the late 1990s and 1999 was perceived as being such a great success and provided a model for the kind of interventions that you're talking about here, that would your argument be that in many ways that was a misleading intervention? It was less the rule than perhaps people have interpreted it as being?
Yeah, it's very rare that a country or a coalition launches a war and then afterwards says, we totally screwed up. This made things worse. It's not in the interest of politicians to do that, and so and the populace that approved this and supported this intervention doesn't want to believe that they actually got more people killed. So invariably we say these things worked. But if you actually look at what happened in Kosovo, in Kosovo there had been for some people this is ancient history. It was 1998, 1999. There was a one-year civil war. 1,000 people were killed over the course of an entire year. They were mainly soldiers and rebels, with a few civilians caught in the crossfire. Then NATO decided to intervene without a UN Security Council authorization, and over the next 3 months, the death toll went from 1,000 to 10,000. That is, NATO intervention increased the death toll tenfold. The killing rate went from 100 a month to 3,000 a month after NATO intervention. What do we call this? Success. It's remarkable. And it's on the basis of this that an international commission came along and said, well, this wasn't authorized, it wasn't legal, but it was justified because it did good. What good did it do? It got a lot more people killed. But you're absolutely right that people look at this and say, well, this was a model. And then the next model was Libya. And again, they're going to say, well, we stopped the bloodbath. And the only problem was there wasn't going to be a bloodbath. Gaddafi's forces had retaken over a half dozen cities, and there was a bloodbath in 0 of those retaken cities. There was one more city to retake, Benghazi. The forces were going to take it. The rebels were going to flee as they'd fled from every other city. The war was going to be over. There was never going to be a bloodbath, and so therefore NATO intervention didn't stop a bloodbath. But proponents of this intervention will say, it stopped the bloodbath, it stopped the genocide, it was a great success, just like Kosovo. So it's very, very hard when there are failures and you call them success, it leads to more future intervention that's likely also to be a failure.
I suppose the argument on the other side would be, if you take the example of Kosovo that we were just talking about there, that came very much as a reaction against the policy in Bosnia, where there were the kind of massacres that you were talking about before. So is policy, to some degree, is it reactive to what has gone before? And also, I suppose we just can't know whether there would have been bloodbaths, because we're always talking about counterfactuals, aren't we?
Certainly, it's impossible to know 100%, right? You can't know if there'll be a bloodbath in Washington, D.C. today or London tomorrow. I can't say that there will not be. Anything's possible. But what you can say is that it's very unlikely that there was going to be a bloodbath in Benghazi, because there hadn't been a bloodbath in any of the other cities that Gaddafi's forces had retaken. Moreover, Gaddafi had said explicitly, I'm not going to harm civilians. I'm only going to harm rebels who refuse to throw down their arms. And he even encouraged them to flee the country. So he hadn't done a bloodbath, he hadn't threatened a bloodbath, and so to me it's extraordinarily unlikely there was going to be a bloodbath. But you raise a very, very important point, which is how do past events affect future events? And the whole intervention policy debate is bedeviled by very poor analogies, which are derived from a poor understanding of prior events and current events. And so you're absolutely right. People thought, there will be a bloodbath in Kosovo because there had been a lot of killing in Bosnia. But if you looked carefully at the case, and as I did in 1998, and it was clear Serb forces were being very restrained in Kosovo in ways that they hadn't been in Bosnia. And so I was writing in 1998 saying, Serbs are not going to kill a whole bunch of ethnic Albanians in Kosovo unless NATO intervenes. Then the Serbs' back will be against the wall. They'll feel they have nothing to lose because NATO has intervened, and then they'll turn on civilians. So the analogy was exactly backwards. The analogy was backwards. The difference between Bosnia and Kosovo showed that there wasn't going to be a bloodbath in Kosovo unless there was NATO intervention. And similarly in Libya. The war was winding down, and if you looked at it closely, it was clear civilians weren't being targeted. If you looked at the town of Misrata, the percentage of casualties that were women were less than 3%. This proved that Gaddafi was targeting militants who were men, not civilians who are half women. And so if you looked closely, it was clear that there was not going to be a bloodbath in Libya unless NATO intervened and the whole civil war escalated and was prolonged. And that's exactly what happened. So you're right, we make decisions based on past events, reading of current events, but we do it based on a very superficial reading of those events. And that's, it's depressing to me because I study these things closely and I try and come up with policy guidance. But policymakers make decisions based on propaganda, poor reporting, misinformation, disinformation. In Benghazi, the advocates for the rebels were the ones who came up with this idea that there was going to be a bloodbath. And they put out press releases and said, unless there's intervention, there's going to be bloodbath. The name for that is not news, it's not information, it's propaganda. And the U.S. government, the government of the greatest country on earth, with the biggest military on earth, fell victim to very cheap and amateurish propaganda.
Well, you can read more on this issue from my guest, Alan Kuperman, in his essay, A Model Humanitarian Intervention, in the journal International Security. But for now, Alan, many thanks indeed for joining us.
Thank you.